Before towns were built and farming changed the shape of the land, Europe and Asia were filled with the sounds of Homo Sapiens and Neanderthals fighting for life in a very dangerous way. They used to live together in caves that still tell their story through cut marks, burned layers, broken skulls, and stone tools that are stained with blood from fights. These bones reveal a troubling truth. People didn't always have to hunt mammoths and reindeer to stay alive. The catch was sometimes another person. Cut marks on bone, evidence of cannibalism. In prehistoric times, bones were the quiet observers of people struggling to stay alive, fighting, and giving up. Long before written records or oral histories could pass down memories from one generation to the next, the acts of our ancestors were remembered by the marks they left on their bodies. The cut marks made by stone tools are the most unsettling and clear of these signs. While researchers were first finding these cuts on human bones, they realized they were not the result of natural decay or an attack by an animal. They were looking at clear proof of cannibalism. Distinguishing human-made cut marks from other damage requires close study. Animal gnawing leaves ragged grooves, and natural weathering produces cracks and flaking. In contrast, stone tools carve sharp V-shaped incisions, often clustered at predictable points, across ribs, around joints, and along the shafts of long bones. These are the exact places butchers today would slice when removing muscle or disarticulating limbs. Microscopic analysis confirms the precision. Straight, shallow incisions produced by repeated strokes, sometimes overlapping as flesh was systematically stripped away. The patterns are too consistent to be dismissed as chance. On human bones found in caves across Europe and Asia, the same anatomical landmarks were targeted again and again. Tendons were cut to free joints. Muscles were sliced from thighs and arms. Skulls were separated from spines, and marrow-rich bones were cracked to release their contents. The cuts match those on deer, horse, and bison bones from the same sites, showing that when resources ran thin, or when violence provided bodies, humans processed their own kind as though they were another source of meat. What makes these cut marks especially compelling is their context. They are not isolated scratches on a few skeletons, but part of wider archaeological deposits. In several caves, clusters of butchered human bones appear in the same layers as butchered animals. This shows that cannibalism was not a one-off response to extreme starvation, but a recurring behavior. Archaeologists often find bones discarded in piles, mixed with animal remains, suggesting that after the meal, little distinction was made between human and non-human prey. Experimental archaeology strengthens this interpretation. Researchers have replicated the butchering of carcasses using flint blades identical to those of the Paleolithic. When the resulting marks are compared under microscopes to those on fossilized human bones, the resemblance is exact. This experimental evidence rules out other explanations and confirms deliberate cutting, dismembering, and marrow extraction. Some of the most disturbing examples show skulls that were carefully separated and prepared, with cut marks circling the base where muscles were detached. These signs indicate decapitation was intentional and practiced. In many cases, the skulls were then broken apart or reshaped, a step that went beyond simple hunger. The processing of heads shows both pragmatism and possibly symbolic meaning, turning even the human face into an object for use. The question of motive remains debated, but the marks themselves speak clearly of intent. Many archaeologists lean towards survival cannibalism during famine, especially in Ice Age Europe, where food sources were unpredictable. In times of scarcity, consuming the dead may have been seen as a grim but necessary act. Others argue the patterned repetition suggests more than desperation, that cannibalism could have also served social or cultural purposes, whether intimidation, punishment, or ritual. Whatever the case, the physical evidence shows that the act was deliberate, repeated, and widely practiced. The fact that these cut marks are so common might be the most troubling thing about it. They have been found in Neanderthal sites, early Homo Sapiens sites, and even sites where their common relatives lived. The action happens again and again in different species and areas. It didn't belong to just one family or society. Instead, it seems to have been a way to stay alive that came up over and over, showing that when the conditions were right, the line between person and animal became less clear. These marks don't just record a behavior. They also destroy the idea that ancient people always showed respect for the dead. People who painted animals on cave walls or made trinkets out of ivory also took flesh off of their bones. The records from archaeology don't give much room for doubt. It wasn't weird for Neanderthals or Homo Sapiens to eat each other. It was just part of the hard equation of life. Krapina, Croatia, the oldest large-scale butchery site. In the northern Croatian limestone hills, there is one of the most amazing places to see how Neanderthals lived and died. This place, called Krapina, has given us more than 800 fossil pieces from dozens of different people. It is one of the best groups of Neanderthal skeletons ever found. It dates back about 120,000 years. But Krapina is really scary not only because of the huge number of bones there, but also because many of them were handled as if they belonged to animals. The excavation of Krapina in the late 19th century initially focused on cataloguing the bones themselves. Skull fragments, jaws, ribs, vertebrae, and long bones representing men, women, and children. But even the earliest descriptions noted unusual modifications. Many of the bones were broken in ways that suggested deliberate cracking rather than natural damage. Over time, closer analysis revealed cut marks and percussion scars consistent with butchery. The evidence pointed to a chilling conclusion. Neanderthals at Krapina were defleshed, dismembered, and had their marrow extracted. It's very clear that the patterns match up with how animals were killed in the same areas. Long bones were cut down the middle to get to the marrow. Heads were broken open to see the brains inside, and ribs were cut along the points where muscles attached. Cutting marks looked at under a microscope show they were made with stone tools, because they have the same sharp-edged lines that can be seen on deer and horse bones found at the site. It is very likely that the Neanderthals at Krapina were treated for food in the same way that wild animals were. The size of the collection makes things more peculiar. Krapina has the bones of at least 24 people, making it one of the best groups of killed Pleistocene humans ever found. The fact that there were adults, teens, and kids of all ages there shows that this wasn't just one group that was affected, but the whole group. Whether these people died because of war, poverty, or cultural practice, the large number of bones suggests that something planned happened rather than something happening by mistake. Some researchers have argued that the marks could reflect secondary burial practices, where bodies were manipulated as part of funerary customs. But the combination of cut marks, fractures, and marrow extraction undermines this explanation. In funerary treatment, bones may be rearranged or defleshed, but they are rarely broken open in such a way as to maximize calorie extraction. At Krapina, the emphasis on marrow and brain tissue makes survival cannibalism the most plausible interpretation. The site also reveals insight into Neanderthal life beyond the butchery. Stone tools found alongside the bones are part of the Mousterian tradition, a toolkit dominated by flake-based scrapers and points. Hearths and fire use are also evident, indicating that these Neanderthals were adept at managing their environment. Yet despite their skill, something drove them to consume their own kind. Climate fluctuations around this time may have reduced available prey, forcing desperate measures. Alternatively, conflict between groups may have produced captives who were then treated as food. One disturbing thing about this is how common this kind of behavior could be. It wasn't just one terrible thing that happened when up to 20 people were killed. It could mean that there were repeated acts of violence or survival eating over time, with Krapina being a place where things piled up. The bones are broken and spread out, which makes it look like they weren't carefully put down, but rather thrown away after being processed, which adds to the impression that they were eaten. We are still learning more about Krapina thanks to new investigative techniques. 3D scans and microscopic research have shown that the cut marks are not real. Chemical studies have looked into what it means to burn and maybe cook. Today, everyone agrees on one thing. The Krapina Neanderthals were killed in a planned way. The bones are one of the oldest and clearest proofs of people eating each other on a big scale. Modern forensic methods continue to refine our understanding of Krapina. 3D imaging and microscopic analysis have confirmed the artificial nature of the cut marks. Chemical studies have explored burning and possible cooking. The consensus today is firm. The Krapina Neanderthals were systematically butchered. The bones stand as one of the earliest and clearest cases of large-scale cannibalism in human history. Moulin-Guercy, France. Neanderthal cannibalism in context. Moulin-Guercy cave is in the southeastern part of France, next to the Rhône River. It has changed the way historians think about Neanderthals forever. This small cave holds the bones of at least 6 Neanderthals from about 100,000 years ago. The bones of 2 adults, 2 teenagers and 2 children show clear signs of cannibalism. Moulin-Guercy, on the other hand, shows a picture of a smaller, more personal event than Krapina's huge gathering. Also, the details are just as scary. The cave was excavated in the 1990s, and from the very beginning, the human bones drew attention. They were intermingled with animal remains, particularly those of deer, and all bore the same types of modifications. Under microscopic analysis, cut marks on the Neanderthal bones mirrored those on the deer bones, showing clear signs of defleshing, dismemberment, and marrow extraction. Long bones were split lengthwise to release fatty tissue, ribs were stripped of muscle, and skulls were fractured to access brain matter. What makes Moulin-Guercy especially important is the precision of the evidence. The cut marks follow anatomical patterns consistent with deliberate butchery. Tendons were sliced at joints, muscles were removed from limb shafts, and jaws were carefully separated. The sequence of actions matches what butchers today would do when processing large animals. This was not random violence or careless scavenging. It was systematic processing of human bodies for food. The fact that there are children's bodies among the bodies adds a scary touch. Archaeologists found small femurs and brain pieces that were broken up in the same way that adult skulls are. The blood and brains of young animals would have been good sources of calories, but the fact that children were included shows how desperate things were. It wasn't just outsiders who were being killed. It may have been intra-group cannibalism, where a whole band ate its own members when food was very scarce. The broader context of Moulin-Guercy supports the survival cannibalism interpretation. Climate records show that the region at the time experienced harsh glacial conditions. Herd animals may have migrated or dwindled, leaving Neanderthal groups without reliable food. In this setting, faced with starvation, they may have turned to the bodies of the recently dead. It's possible that the 6 individuals found at Moulin-Guercy died of natural causes or hunger before their remains were processed by survivors. Some bones show perimortem fractures, injuries inflicted around the time of death, that suggest the individuals may have been killed before being butchered. If so, this would point to cannibalism not just as a desperate measure, but as a deliberate choice, perhaps even against members of rival groups. Without written records, motive remains uncertain, but the bones speak clearly. The line between kin and food was crossed. A curious aspect about Moulin-Guercy is how he compares how people treat animals to how people treat people. Archaeologists looked at designs on thousands of deer bones from the same layers and found that they were all the same. This shows that the Neanderthals treated a body the same way they would have treated a dead animal from a hunt. Meat was cut up, marrow was taken out, and bones were thrown away. The fact that species are not different from each other shows how realistic and heartless life can be. The site also provides insight into Neanderthal technology and skill. The cut marks were made with stone flakes, sharp-edged tools struck from prepared cores. These flakes could slice with surgical precision. allowing efficient processing of both humans and animals. The ability to carry out such detailed butchery shows that Neanderthals had not only the physical tools, but also the anatomical knowledge to maximize resources. Mulagirsi stands out because it is one of the few sites where archaeologists can rule out alternative explanations. At other caves, debates linger over whether cut marks were made by humans or animals, or whether bones were accidentally broken. Here, the evidence is unequivocal. The combination of cut marks, marrow extraction, and the presence of both adults and children makes cannibalism the only reasonable conclusion. Cannibalism at Mulagirsi was not ritualistic in the sense of elaborate ceremony. There are no signs of burial, ornamentation, or symbolic treatment of the dead. Instead, the cave tells a story of survival under crushing conditions when every calorie mattered and human flesh became a resource. For the Neanderthals of Mulagirsi, necessity stripped away the boundaries we take for granted today. El Cidrón, Spain. A clan consumed. El Cidrón Cave is one of the most frightening Neanderthal sites ever found. It is deep in the woods of Asturias in northern Spain. It was found in 1994 and has since given us the bones of at least 12 Neanderthals, including men, women, and children. All of their bodies clearly show signs of having been killed. El Cidrón gives us a clear and personal picture of what happened when a whole group was eaten, unlike the smaller groups found at Mulagirsi or the older layers at Krapina. The bones from El Cidrón are not isolated fragments scattered randomly across the cave floor. Instead, they are concentrated in layers dated to around 49,000 years ago, carefully sealed by geological processes that preserved them in remarkable condition. This has allowed scientists to study them with unprecedented precision. What they found is evidence of systematic processing, defleshing, disarticulation, marrow extraction, and even skull splitting. Microscopic analysis revealed hundreds of cut marks, each matching the sharp V-shaped grooves left by stone tools. The locations of these marks are telling. They occur at tendon attachment points on arms and legs, along rib cages where muscles attach, and around skull bases where jaws were separated. These are the same places butchers target when dismembering animals. In addition, percussion scars on long bones show they were deliberately struck to crack open marrow cavities. Forensic studies concluded without hesitation. The Neanderthals of El Cidrón were butchered with the same precision as prey animals. The fact that there are children's bodies among the dead adds a troubling touch. Small bones like femurs and ribs break and cut in the same ways that adult bones do. In other words, this means that no one was safe. It looks like whole families were treated, which means that what happened here wasn't just symbolic or picky, but all-encompassing. The big question is, why? Archaeologists have debated whether the cannibalism at El Cidrón was driven by starvation, violence, or ritual. Stable isotope studies of the bones hint at malnutrition, with some individuals showing signs of dietary stress. It is possible that the group faced severe food shortages and turned to cannibalism as a survival strategy. On the other hand, the thoroughness of the butchery has led some researchers to suggest deliberate extermination, perhaps at the hands of rival groups. DNA analysis has provided an extraordinary layer of detail. Scientists extracted genetic material from several of the individuals, revealing that they were closely related, likely members of the same extended family. This rules out the possibility that they were outsiders captured and consumed. Instead, it suggests intra-group cannibalism, where surviving members of a starving band processed the bodies of their own kin. If true, it paints a picture of desperation almost beyond comprehension, a community so overwhelmed by hunger that they consumed themselves. The lack of funeral customs is another disturbing fact. At other Neanderthal sites, the dead were buried on purpose, and the living even took care of them. There isn't any at El Cidrón. The bodies were taken apart, sorted, and thrown away without a ceremony. This lack of evidence says that the need to survive took precedence over social or spiritual concerns. People turned the dead into tools when they were hungry, not family members. The cave also preserves indirect evidence of the process itself. Burn marks on some bones suggest attempts at cooking. although not all fragments show signs of heat. Some bones were likely roasted to make flesh easier to strip, while others were consumed raw. The variation indicates improvisation, different techniques tried in an effort to extract as much nourishment as possible. Because of its size and the fact that archaeology and genetics are both used there, El Cedrón has become one of the most important places to learn about how Neanderthals lived. It is very rare to be able to connect eating with family ties, and it makes us think about how grimly practical people can be when they are hungry. These people were not enemies or strangers. They were parents, children, siblings, and brothers and sisters. They were killed because the living had no other choice. The site remains controversial. Some scholars argue that the processing may have had symbolic dimensions, with cannibalism serving as part of ritual practices rather than simple desperation. But the overwhelming evidence of malnutrition, the completeness of the butchery, and the lack of symbolic treatment all point toward survival cannibalism. For many researchers, El Cedrón represents one of the most extreme examples of human adaptation to crisis. Gough's Cave, England, skull cups and ritual processing. Cheddar Gorge is a scenic limestone gorge in the rolling hills of Somerset, England. People have lived in its caves for tens of thousands of years. One of them stands out, Gough's Cave. It's beautiful, but it also holds some very scary proof. Around 15,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic, this site showed that Homo sapiens practiced a type of killing that is so organized and symbolic that it still shocks researchers today. The discovery at Gough's Cave was no small find. Archaeologists unearthed human remains belonging to at least 5 individuals, including adults, adolescents, and children. But these bones did not resemble those of a respectful burial. Instead, they bore hundreds of cut marks, fractures, and modifications identical to those found on animal bones from the same layers. The humans at Gough's Cave had been butchered with the same precision as horses and deer. Long bones were split open to extract marrow, one of the most calorie-rich resources available. Ribs and vertebrae were sliced clean of muscle. Even more chilling, the skulls were carefully modified into usable objects, skull cups. The tops of crania were cut, shaped, and smoothed, transforming them into vessels that could hold liquid. This was not clumsy damage, it was deliberate craftsmanship. The skull cups provide the clearest sign that what happened here was more than desperate survival. The processing of the bones suggests an organized sequence of actions, not the chaotic improvisation of starving people. After defleshing, the skulls were prepared with care, suggesting that they were intended for reuse in ritual contexts. Whether for drinking, ceremonies, or intimidation, these skull cups carried symbolic weight beyond mere nutrition. Microscopic analysis has revealed further detail. The cut marks on the skulls show careful, repetitive scraping, consistent with the removal of tissue for the purpose of shaping rather than consumption. The edges of the cups were deliberately thinned and rounded, preventing sharp surfaces that might cut a hand or lip. This kind of preparation points to forethought and planning, not hurried survival measures. The placement of the remains within the cave also hints at ritual. While some bones appear discarded alongside animal remains, others seem to have been kept apart. The skull cups, in particular, were deposited in areas that suggest special treatment. Whether they were left as offerings or stored for reuse is unknown, but their presence alongside butchered remains makes clear that cannibalism here had a symbolic, perhaps spiritual dimension. The processing of marrow-rich bones and the thorough removal of soft tissue show that the bodies were valued as food sources. In a world where hunting success was uncertain and winters were long, every calorie counted. Cannibalism at Gough's Cave may have been both practical and symbolic, a fusion of survival and ritual. The individuals processed were not anonymous outsiders. Genetic studies of later remains from Cheddar Gorge showed that the people living in the region were part of long-lasting bands with deep ties to the land. This suggests the victims may have been members of the same community. If so, their transformation into food and ritual objects was not just about survival or warfare, but about integrating the dead into the life of the living. Drinking from a skull cup may have been seen as a way of keeping a person's essence within the group. What did it mean to be human in the Upper Paleolithic? Gough's cave makes us think again. These were not cruel acts done without thinking. They were planned activities that were done with stone tools from the culture of the Magdalenians, who were famous for their art, carvings, and complex symbolic language. In this place, eating each other wasn't a sign of being wild. It was part of the culture that made cave drawings and fine bone ornaments. Cima de los Huesos, Spain, the Pit of Bones. The Pit of Bones, or Cima de los Huesos, is one of the most mysterious places where people lived in prehistoric times. It is deep inside the Atapuerca cave system in northern Spain. This room was found in the 1970s and has been dug up for decades. It holds the remains of at least 28 people who lived about 430,000 years ago. People often say that this is the world's first mass grave, but the bones tell a darker and more complicated story. They have marks of injuries, intentional deposition, and even marrow extraction marks that suggest they may have been cannibals. The individuals preserved at Cima de los Huesos are generally classified as early Neanderthals or their ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis. Unlike scattered bones found in many Paleolithic sites, here the remains were concentrated in a deep shaft, accessible only by crawling through a narrow tunnel and descending into a dark pit. The sheer effort required to place bodies there raises questions about intent. Were these deliberate burials an early sign of ritual, or was the pit a convenient disposal site for the dead? Initial interpretations lean towards symbolic burial, but closer examination of the fossils has shifted the debate. Several skulls show evidence of violent trauma. The most famous is cranium 17, which bears two nearly identical fractures on the forehead, blows delivered by the same object. Forensic analysis confirms these were perimortem injuries, inflicted at or near the time of death. This makes cranium 17 one of the earliest confirmed homicide victims in human history. Violence, however, may not have been the only fate awaiting the people of Cima de los Huesos. Microscopic studies of the long bones revealed breakage patterns consistent with marrow extraction. The shafts were fractured in spiral patterns, the kind produced when bones are cracked while still fresh. In addition, cut marks consistent with stone tool use appear on some skeletal elements. These details strongly resemble processing marks found on animal bones at hunting sites, suggesting that human bodies here may have been butchered like prey. Whether this represents full cannibalism or selective marrow consumption remains debated. Some researchers argue that the fracturing could reflect post-depositional processes like cave collapse. Yet the similarity of the modifications to known butchery practices is difficult to ignore. If correct, it would place Cima de los Huesos among the oldest pieces of evidence for cannibalism in the human lineage. Alongside the 28 skeletons, archaeologists found a single hand axe of exquisite craftsmanship, dubbed Excalibur. Unlike the crude flake tools typical of the period, this biface was finely shaped from red quartzite, a material not commonly used in the area. Its presence among the bones suggests intentional placement, perhaps as an offering. But an offering to what or to whom remains unclear. If the pit was a burial site, Excalibur could represent one of the earliest symbolic gestures by humans. If it was a dumping ground after violent death, the tool might be a marker of dominance or ritual control. The preservation of the remains also provides rare insight into life during the Middle Pleistocene. The bones belong to both sexes and a wide range of ages, from children to middle-aged adults. Dental studies show heavy wear, suggesting a tough diet of raw plants and meat. Skeletal stress markers indicate a life of constant physical strain. Many individuals carried healed fractures, showing that injury was a regular part of survival. Yet the collective deposition in one place ties their stories together, raising questions about what catastrophe, or cultural practice, brought them here. Some researchers think that the Cima people may be victims of strife between groups. Violence would have been always possible in a world where small groups of people were fighting over resources and land, It's possible that dissecting or eating of dead bodies after death played a role in this war. Others think the pit may have been a place where people in the town buried their dead, including some violent deaths along with natural ones. There is no question about how important the site is. Cima de los Huesos is in the middle of the range of Neanderthal burial sites, between those that were just for looting and those that were more meaningful. It shows that people were already doing things that were a mix of survival, violence, and maybe even rituals 500,000 years ago. Even though the bones are still, their broken pieces, cut marks, and placement say a lot about how hard life was for early humans. Cro-Magnon body size versus Neanderthals. Their bodies were built to survive, so Homo sapiens didn't look exactly like us when they came to Europe during the Ice Age. These early modern people were tall, thin, and had long legs. They were called Cro-Magnons. Neanderthals, on the other hand, lived at the same time and were shorter, stockier, and much more muscular. This physique difference wasn't just for looks. What each species did to hunt, survive hard environments, and eventually compete with each other depended on it. The fossil record tells the story clearly. Cro-Magnons often stood between 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet 1 inch tall, remarkably tall for prehistory and significantly taller than medieval Europeans thousands of years later. Neanderthals, by comparison, averaged closer to 5 feet 4 inches for males and just under 5 feet for females. Their stocky frames featured broad rib cages, barrel-shaped chests, and exceptionally thick bones. Muscle attachment sites on their skeletons suggest they carried extraordinary upper body strength, rivaling elite modern athletes. But strength and endurance are not the same thing. Cro-Magnons had narrower pelvises, longer legs, and lighter builds that made them exceptional long-distance walkers and runners. Their lean frames dissipated heat more efficiently, an advantage in open grasslands and during persistence hunting, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Neanderthals, with their short limbs and wide torsos, conserved heat better, a critical trait for surviving glacial winters. Yet their build limited mobility and endurance, making them better suited for short bursts of explosive power than for long pursuits. Hunting strategies reflected these differences. Neanderthals relied heavily on ambush tactics. Armed with heavy thrusting spears, they waited in cover and then attacked prey at close range. Such hunting required immense strength and carried significant risks. Broken bones and serious injuries were common. Cro-Magnons, meanwhile, favored ranged weapons and endurance hunting. Their taller, lighter bodies allowed them to stalk game across miles of terrain, throwing spears or later using atlatls to strike from a safer distance. This efficiency reduced injury and increased success rates. The climate of Europe provided alternating advantages. During cold glacial periods, Neanderthals' stocky frames gave them resilience against freezing conditions. But as climates warmed and open grasslands expanded, Cro-Magnons thrived. Their ability to cover ground and adapt to varied environments gave them an edge in tracking herds and exploiting new food sources. Over generations, this mobility may have helped them expand faster into Neanderthal territories. Skeletal studies also reveal differences in daily life. Neanderthal bones show high levels of stress, fractures, and wear, consistent with a lifestyle that demanded immense physical exertion. Their survival was brutal, requiring constant close-quarters confrontations with prey and predators. Cro-Magnon skeletons, while still showing signs of hardship, generally display fewer traumatic injuries, suggesting that their hunting techniques reduced direct risks. Their build was not just an accident of evolution, it was an adaptation that favored efficiency over brute force. Brain size is another dimension. Neanderthals had slightly larger average brain volumes, up to 1,600 cubic centimeters, compared to Cro-Magnons' 1,400–1,500 cubic centimeters. But size is not everything. The shape of the brain cases suggests differences in organization, with Cro-Magnons having more developed frontal lobes associated with planning, strategy, and symbolic thought. Combined with their leaner bodies, this mental flexibility likely amplified their survival advantage. They could strategize, cooperate, and adapt their hunting methods more dynamically than Neanderthals. It's easy to see this as a battle of brains versus brawn, but the truth is more complicated. Neanderthals were very strong and knew how to live in their settings well. Cro-Magnons, on the other hand, took a different genetic risk by giving up some of their raw strength in exchange for speed, stamina, and the ability to respond to new situations. If you needed to save energy to stay alive, those traits would be very important. This difference in body size also had societal effects. Cro-Magnon groups that were bigger could move through regions more easily, share resources, and connect with more people. Neanderthal groups were usually smaller and more spread out because they had to hunt close up and use a lot of energy to stay alive. This may have made them worse over time by keeping them alone. The physical differences between Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals were not trivial. They shaped how each species hunted, traveled, and lived. When food was abundant, both thrived. But in times of scarcity, the taller, leaner Cro-Magnons may have simply been more efficient survivors. In the brutal Ice Age chessboard, efficiency often beat raw power. Weapon technology gap. When hunting and fighting were the only ways to stay alive, the tools a species brought could mean the difference between living and dying. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, early Homo Sapiens, both made spears with stone tips, but there was a big difference in how they used and improved these tools. This gap gave the Cro-Magnons a big advantage, which changed how they hunted and how they fought with the Neanderthals. The Neanderthal toolkit centered on thrusting spears. These were robust, heavy weapons, wooden shafts tipped with stone points carefully shaped through flaking. Archaeological finds like the spears at Schöningen in Germany, dating back more than 300,000 years, show remarkable craftsmanship. Balanced for close-range strikes, they worked like oversized javelins, but lacked aerodynamic refinement. Neanderthals, with their immense upper body strength, wielded them with devastating force. But the method was risky. To strike prey, they had to close the distance. Skeletons from Neanderthal sites reveal a pattern of healed fractures similar to those seen in modern rodeo riders, evidence of dangerous encounters with massive animals like bison and mammoths. Cro-Magnons refined hunting into a safer, more efficient practice. Their key innovation was the throwing spear. By shaping slimmer, lighter shafts and more aerodynamic tips, they created weapons optimized for long-distance attacks. Later, they developed the atlatl, or spear thrower, a carved lever that extended the throwing arm and multiplied force. With this tool, a hunter could hurl a spear at far greater velocity, increasing both range and penetration. Evidence from sites in France and Central Europe shows spear tips with fractures caused by high-speed impacts, confirming their use as projectiles rather than thrusting tools. This leap in technology transformed hunting strategies. Neanderthals excelled in ambush, waiting in forests or rocky terrain where prey could be trapped and stabbed at close range. Cro-Magnons, by contrast, could engage from a distance, reducing risk of injury and increasing their success rate. They could harry prey across open plains, wounding animals and trailing them until exhaustion set in, a technique called persistence hunting. Endurance bodies, longer legs, and projectile weapons worked together in a survival system that reduced the dangers of brute force encounters. Weapon diversity also widened the gap. Neanderthals relied on multi-purpose tools, like the Mousterian hand axe, which served as both a weapon and butchering implement. Cro-Magnons, however, developed specialized tools: barbed points for fishing, burins for carving, scrapers for hide preparation, and finely retouched blades for hunting. This specialization reflects not just technological skill, but also social organization, larger groups capable of dividing labor and sharing innovations. The variety in their toolkit meant Cro-Magnons could adapt to more environments and exploit resources that Neanderthals rarely used. Conflict between the two species magnified the difference. Imagine a confrontation at the mouth of a cave. Neanderthals with thrusting spears had to close the gap depending on strength and surprise. Cro-Magnons could stand back, hurling volleys of projectiles before retreating. Even small groups of Homo Sapiens could repel larger Neanderthal bands by exploiting distance. Archaeological evidence supports this scenario. Some Neanderthal remains bear wounds consistent with projectile strikes, a weapon they themselves never developed. No longer just a physical gap, the tool gap was also a mental one. To make projectile guns, people had to plan ahead, think ahead, and work together. Shafts had to be bent, tips had to be carefully made, and ties had to be held in place with glues like resin or sinew. It took time and teamwork to test for balance and accuracy. This investment shows that the Cro-Magnons didn't just see guns as tools. They saw them as systems, things that were made better through shared knowledge and trial and error. Neanderthals were very good at making tools, but their collection seems to have been more traditional, with many of the tools being copies of older designs. What's often forgotten is how these tools changed the way people interacted with each other. Cro-Magnons could kill bigger animals more safely with long-range guns, which meant they could bring back more meat to feed larger groups. In turn, bigger groups meant better networks, more teamwork, and faster progress. Neanderthals stuck together in smaller, less secure groups because they had to use risky ways to hunt. Over time, this mismatch in population made the technical one worse. The archaeological record makes the divide unmistakable. At Neanderthal sites, spear tips are thicker, sturdier, and optimized for impact at close range. At Cro-Magnon sites, points are slimmer, lighter, and crafted with symmetry for flight. Where analysis under microscopes shows projectile-specific damage on Cro-Magnon tools, while Neanderthal tools bear stress fractures from thrusting. Even the prey bones reflect this divide. Impact marks from high-velocity strikes appear in Cro-Magnon contexts, but not in Neanderthal ones. Nighttime hunting strategies. There was no sleep during the Ice Age. Predators woke up when it got dark in Europe's fields and woods. During the night, lions, hyenas, cave bears, and saber-toothed cats roamed the area, ready to attack. The best thing for most animals to do was to hide and wait for dawn. But there is proof that both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons did the opposite sometimes. They went out at night to hunt, putting themselves and their food at risk of being eaten by some of the most dangerous animals in prehistoric times. The clues come from prey bones and weapon marks. At sites across Europe and Africa, remains of nocturnal or crepuscular animals, those active at night or twilight, bear the unmistakable traces of human hunting. Horses, wild boars, and antelope show spear punctures, consistent with ambushes carried out in low light. The positioning of kill sites near waterholes and animal tracks supports the idea that humans timed their hunts to the rhythms of prey, striking at dusk or night when animals came to drink or move. Neanderthals, with their robust frames and thrusting spears, were masters of ambush. Fossil evidence suggests they often hunted from close range, hiding near paths and striking as animals passed. Night hunts would have amplified both their strengths and their risks. Reduced visibility meant more reliance on memory, positioning, and sudden power. Many Neanderthal skeletons carry injuries that fit this scenario. Broken ribs, skull fractures, and limb damage from grappling with large prey in chaotic conditions. The night made every encounter more unpredictable. Cro-Magnons approached the dark differently. Tall, lean, and equipped with throwing spears, they could attack from a distance even in low light. Archaeological finds show projectile tips with damage consistent with high-velocity impacts, evidence of long-distance strikes. This suggests that Cro-Magnons may have coordinated nighttime persistence hunts, wounding prey, then following it through the night until exhaustion set in. Such tactics required more than brute strength. They demanded coordination, endurance, and communication in silence. The use of fire becomes crucial here. Burned wood fragments found at certain kill sites indicate that torches may have been part of night hunts. Firelight could startle prey, blind animals temporarily, or be used to drive them toward hidden hunters. But the fire was double-edged. Too much light gave away human positions to predators and prey alike. The charred remains at some sites show that groups experimented with controlled use. brief, flickering light to aid movement, then darkness as the ambush began. There was always competition with animals. In some ancient sites, marks made by humans and marks made by animal teeth are found on the same bones. This means that people and animals that eat meat were probably often at the same kill sites, and sometimes they were fighting. Because they are used to hunting at night, lions and hyenas would not have been afraid to face people. There were huge risks. If the hunt failed, the animals could go hungry or even get attacked by the top predators. But the fact that human tool marks were found on animals that were active at night shows that these hunts happened often, and not just by accident. Night hunting also reveals the growing importance of cooperation. In daylight, hunters could see and react to each other's movements. At night, trust and planning mattered more. Silent signals, rehearsed positions, and anticipation of prey movement were essential. Archaeologists can only speculate on how these groups coordinated, but the very existence of repeated nighttime kills implies some form of organized teamwork. For Cro-Magnons, this may have sharpened social bonds and honed the communication skills that set them apart. The rewards of night hunting were significant. Prey animals were often less cautious in darkness, relying on senses humans could outsmart with planning. A successful hunt brought calories, hides, and bones at times when daylight opportunities were scarce. For groups facing long winters and limited food, the willingness to risk the night may have made survival possible. The risks, on the other hand, were written in stone. Fractures that have healed on Neanderthal remains show that they came close to big animals, probably when it wasn't very bright. Cro-Magnon remains have fewer injuries from direct force damage and more wounds from projectile weapons, which fits with their distance tactics. The way each species faced the darkness showed how it was built and what technology it had. Absence of defensive structures. Archaeologists often find clear signs of defense when they dig into Neolithic towns or Bronze Age cities from later times in human history. Structures like walls, ditches, palisades, and lookout points were all used to try to keep towns safe from attack. But there is something very different about the world of the Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens that we see when we go back tens of thousands of years. There are no walls or other defenses. There are no limits. There are no built barriers of any kind. The lack of information in the ancient record makes us wonder how these groups defended themselves when they were in danger. It looks like the answer is that they didn't do it very often. Neanderthals relied heavily on caves and rock shelters. These natural formations offered weather protection, concealment from predators, and warmth in the winter. But as safe as caves may seem, they carried fatal vulnerabilities. A single fire at the entrance could smoke out or suffocate everyone inside. A determined enemy could block exits, trap occupants, or wait for starvation to take its toll. Unlike fortified villages of later eras, Neanderthal shelters were practical homes, but poor strongholds. Homo sapiens or Cro-Magnons also used caves, but they left behind more evidence of open-air camps. These consisted of temporary structures built from mammoth bones, wood and hides, often clustered around hearths. The layout of these camps suggests greater mobility. Unlike Neanderthals, who returned to the same shelters repeatedly, Cro-Magnons seemed more willing to dismantle and relocate. This flexibility was itself a defensive strategy. Rather than fortifying one position, they reduced the risk of ambush by moving frequently and unpredictably. The lack of built defenses may also reflect group size. Neanderthal bands were small, often no more than 20 to 30 individuals. Constructing barriers would have required time, manpower, and resources better spent on immediate survival tasks like hunting and fuel gathering. Even if they anticipated danger, the effort needed to fortify a cave would have been overwhelming. Cro-Magnon groups were somewhat larger, with wider social networks, but their mobility meant they did not invest in permanent defenses either. When rival groups clashed, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons alike were forced to rely on strength, weapons, and terrain rather than prepared defenses. This imbalance became critical when Homo sapiens introduced ranged weapons. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthal bones with projectile injuries, arrows or spears striking from distances they could not counter. Without walls or barriers to shield themselves, Neanderthals were vulnerable to attacks that began long before hand-to-hand combat. The burned cave layers uncovered at sites in France and Spain support this view. In some cases, alternating layers of Neanderthal tools and Cro-Magnon tools are separated by thick deposits of ash. This suggests that fire was used deliberately to drive out or eliminate cave occupants. With no fortifications or escape tunnels, those trapped inside had little chance of survival. Once abandoned, the caves were quickly reoccupied by rivals, leaving a stark record of conquest. The archaeological silence on defenses may also reveal something about how threats were perceived. Neanderthals were skilled hunters and strong fighters, but their social structures were small and localized. They may not have viewed other groups as constant enemies to be guarded against. Cro-Magnons, by contrast, maintained broader contact networks, which may have reduced some hostility while amplifying competition for territory. In both cases, the absence of defensive structures reflects a world where survival strategies were immediate and reactive, not long-term and strategic. This absence of defenses also speaks to the imbalance that developed between the two species. Cro-Magnons could adapt by relocating camps, sharing resources across networks, and using ranged weapons to protect themselves. Neanderthals, tied to caves and direct strength, were at a disadvantage. When fire or projectiles came, their shelters became death traps rather than safe havens. Over generations, this vulnerability may have accelerated their decline. Contrasting archaeological sites, art versus violence. Few differences in ancient times are as shocking as this one. The walls of one cave are covered with paintings of horses galloping, aurochs charging, and beautiful deer, while in another, the ashes of dead people are lying all over the place. The world of the Ice Age left us both stunningly beautiful and horrifyingly violent artifacts, often in the same environments, and even in the same cultural horizons. This paradox makes us think about how early humans could be two different things at the same time. They could paint wonders by torchlight and also hunt their own kind. The painted caves of Western Europe remain some of humanity's most iconic treasures. At Lascaux in France, discovered in 1940, nearly 600 animal figures cover the walls, layered in vibrant ochre and charcoal pigments. Chauvet Cave, dating even earlier, displays lions, woolly rhinoceroses, and mammoths with such detail that modern artists marvel at the accuracy of muscle tone and movement. These were not casual doodles. They required preparation, pigments carried from miles away, scaffolding built to reach ceilings, and careful use of fire to light dark chambers. The artistry reveals imagination, symbolism, and shared cultural rituals that extended far beyond survival. Yet just a few hundred kilometers from these sanctuaries of art, other caves tell a darker tale. At Gauve's Cave in England, human bones were found alongside butchered horse and deer remains, processed with the same precision. Skulls were reshaped into drinking cups, long bones cracked for marrow, and flesh stripped with practiced cuts. At Moulaguercy Cave in France, the remains of at least 6 Neanderthals, including children, were defleshed and discarded with animal carcasses. In both cases, the cut marks are indistinguishable from those left on prey, proving that cannibalism was not an aberration, but part of life. The paradox is even stronger because these places are happening at the same time. People from the same larger groups who made pictures of beautiful animals were also killing people. Survival, cannibalism, and symbolic expression went hand in hand, sometimes within the same societal context. This shows that early humans did not see art and violence as being at odds with each other. Both were parts of their world. One captured the spirit of life, and the other made sure they could stay alive when supplies ran out. Extra contrast is added by artifacts. Archaeologists find beads, trinkets, and carved figurines in painted caves. These are creative and decorative items. At cannibalistic sites, they find broken bones, percussion marks, and scraping lines. These are signs of hunger, despair, or maybe even religious violence. The fact that both sets of items come from the same Ice Age area shows that the human story has always been full of contradictions. Some researchers argue that the two activities may not have been entirely separate. Just as cave art might have been linked to hunting rituals, cannibalism may have carried symbolic meaning beyond calories. A skull reshaped into a cup could serve as both a practical container and a reminder of dominance or remembrance. Others suggest the practices were purely pragmatic, art as social bonding, cannibalism as survival. Either way, the archaeological record shows that Ice Age humanity was not defined by a single behavior. It was a spectrum that ranged from breathtaking beauty to grim necessity. The paradox is made stronger by the places where these things happen. In the southwest of France, Chauvet's beautiful lions are about a day's walk away from Moulin-Guercy's bodies that have been killed. In England, cannibals lived in the same rock settings that artists did. During the Ice Age, the world was full of extremes. Both beauty and cruelty were realities that people shared. It's easy for modern readers to praise the art and brush off the violence as an oddity. But the facts show that simplicity is not a good idea. These were people who had to deal with difficult environments, supplies that were hard to predict, and rival groups. In that world, you had to be flexible to stay alive. That sometimes meant painting a bison in dim flashlight light, and other times meant cutting open a human leg to get the marrow out of it. DNA evidence of hybridization. The story of the Neanderthals was told for a long time as one of replacing. When Homo Sapiens came to Europe, they beat out their stockier cousins in battle and wiped them out. In the early 2000s, however, science made a discovery that broke this simple story. Scientists carefully removed ancient DNA from preserved bones and found that Neanderthals and modern humans did more than just fight. They bred. Today, that genetic heritage is still alive and well in the DNA of billions of people around the world. The first breakthrough came from Vindija Cave in Croatia. Scientists managed to sequence fragments of Neanderthal DNA from bones more than 40,000 years old. When they compared those sequences to the genomes of living humans, the results were startling. Non-African populations, whether European, Asian, or indigenous American, carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This proved that when Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa and into Neanderthal territory, contact was not limited to violence. At least some of those encounters were intimate. In Siberia's Denisova cave, researchers uncovered a finger bone belonging to a young girl. Genetic testing revealed something unprecedented. Her mother was Neanderthal, her father Denisovan, another archaic human lineage. This single fossil proved that interbreeding between species was not hypothetical. It happened directly, producing children of mixed ancestry. Although Denisovans are a separate story, the evidence showed that human evolution was far more entangled than once believed. For Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, interbreeding left signatures in both skeletons and genes. Some fossils display mixed traits, elongated skulls with rounded brain cases, for example, that may reflect hybrid ancestry. DNA studies confirm that these were not isolated unions, but occurred multiple times across Europe and Western Asia. The genetic overlap is strongest in regions where Homo sapiens first entered Neanderthal lands, suggesting repeated contact during periods of coexistence. Still, the scale of hybridization was limited. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct species around 40,000 years ago, and their DNA makes up only a small fraction of the modern genome. This suggests that while interbreeding happened, it was not widespread enough to preserve their identity. Instead, Neanderthals were gradually absorbed, their genetic fragments surviving in Homo sapiens populations that outnumbered and eventually replaced them. The impact of those genes remains significant. Research has shown that Neanderthal DNA influences everything from immune system responses to skin and hair traits. Some Neanderthal variants may have helped early humans adapt to colder climates or resist unfamiliar pathogens in Eurasia. Others, however, have been linked to conditions like diabetes and depression in modern populations. The genetic inheritance is a double-edged sword, a reminder of both survival advantages and lingering vulnerabilities passed down from long-extinct relatives. The revelation of hybridization also changes how we view Neanderthal Homo sapiens encounters. Archaeological evidence still speaks of violence, cut marks on bones, sudden population declines, burned cave layers, but DNA shows that there were also moments of connection. Whether through cooperation, trade, or personal bonds, some Neanderthals and modern humans shared more than territory. They shared families. This interbreeding may have shaped the very end of the Neanderthal story. Small, isolated groups were vulnerable to being absorbed into larger Homo sapiens populations. Hybrid children, raised among sapiens, may have diluted Neanderthal genetic identity further, accelerating their decline. By the time Neanderthals vanished, their legacy had already been embedded within their rivals. From a science point of view, finding old DNA is a big deal. It is very hard to get weak genetic material out of fossils that are tens of thousands of years old. Still, these methods have changed the way we think about past and given us direct biological links to our ancestors. DNA has given bones a voice where bones alone could not speak. Climatic stress and starvation. During the Ice Age, life in Europe was harsh. Within a few hundred years, temperatures changed quickly, ice moved forward and backward, and environments changed. Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens relied on these changes to stay alive. Archaeological and biological data shows that both species had to deal with repeated periods of hunger, poor diet, and the need to move. But the effects were not equal. Homo sapiens were better able to adapt, while Neanderthals were devastated by changes in the climate. Stable isotope analysis of bones provides some of the clearest evidence. By measuring nitrogen and carbon isotopes preserved in fossils, scientists can reconstruct ancient diets. Neanderthals consistently show nitrogen values similar to top carnivores like wolves, meaning their diet was dominated by large Ice Age herbivores such as mammoths, bison, and reindeer. This reliance worked well when herds were abundant. But isotope records also reveal sudden drops, pointing to times when prey numbers collapsed. These dips align with climatic events, suggesting that when cold waves hit and ecosystems shifted, Neanderthal food sources disappeared almost overnight. The physical evidence of starvation is written in their bones and teeth. Many juvenile Neanderthals show enamel hyperplasia, lines or pits on teeth caused when growth was disrupted by malnutrition. Some individuals bear multiple episodes, marking repeated cycles of hunger during childhood. Bones from sites in Spain and France reveal stunted growth, fragile structures, and signs of anemia. These were not isolated cases. They represent a pattern of chronic food stress in Neanderthal populations. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, left isotope signatures showing more dietary flexibility. While they too hunted large game, they also exploited fish, birds, nuts, and plant resources. At coastal sites in Iberia, shell middens reveal heavy reliance on seafood, a source Neanderthals almost never tapped. In river valleys, Cro-Magnons harvested fish and waterfowl, while inland groups supplemented diets with seeds and tubers. This adaptability provided insurance against the climatic swings of the Ice Age. When mammoth herds vanished from one region, Homo sapiens could switch to marine resources or broaden their foraging strategies. Neanderthals, locked into high-meat diets, starved. The consequences of this difference appear in archaeological layers. In times of harsh cold, Neanderthal occupations often vanish from the record, suggesting abandonment of entire regions. When Cro-Magnons appear in those same areas, they bring evidence of varied diets and more stable survival. This contrast reveals why one species endured environmental instability while the other dwindled. Flexibility, not strength, became the decisive trait. At El Sidrón Cave in Spain, the story becomes even more haunting. The butchered remains of 12 Neanderthals include children whose teeth show enamel hyperplasia, proof of childhood malnutrition. Their bones also reveal stunted growth, suggesting long-term food shortages. Combined with cut marks and marrow extraction on the same skeletons, the evidence points to famine-driven cannibalism. This was not a ritual. It was survival in the face of starvation. Groups consumed their own to endure winters that offered no other option. The bigger picture is shown by climate data found in ice cores. Heinrich events were sudden periods of cooling that happened in Europe around 40,000 years ago. This was during the fall of the Neanderthals. The sudden cold snaps caused the ecosystem to fail. Rivers froze, woods shrank, and prey groups spread out. It became impossible for small groups of Neanderthals to stay alive. Cro-Magnons could move or change because they had bigger social networks and ate a wider range of foods. Neanderthals were stuck because they were tied to certain areas and had few supplies. Starvation didn't just kill directly, it weakened populations in more subtle but devastating ways. Malnutrition reduced fertility, increased infant mortality, and made adults more vulnerable to disease. For small groups already numbering in the dozens, a few harsh winters could cut populations so low they could not recover. Archaeological gaps of hundreds or even thousands of years in Neanderthal sites reflect these population crashes. The story of climatic stress shows that extinction wasn't caused by a single fight or creation, but by many environmental disasters. With each new glacier, the Neanderthals were hit harder, and their numbers dropped until Homo Sapiens came along and filled the holes. It wasn't just between species, it was also between being flexible and being fixed. The Cro-Magnons' more general ways of staying alive won that battle. Mass kill sites of animals. Mass kill sites, or places where dozens or even hundreds of animals were killed in a single organized hunt, are some of the most exciting things that archaeologists have found in the Ice Age. These sites show how advanced human hunting methods were, how people were able to change the scenery, and how powerful teamwork can be. Also, they bring up a scary question. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens could plan hunts to kill whole numbers of animals, could they have done the same thing to rival human groups? One of the most famous examples comes from La Côte de Saint-Brelade on the island of Jersey. Excavations revealed enormous deposits of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros bones concentrated at the base of a ravine. The distribution strongly suggests that Neanderthals deliberately drove herds over a cliff. The fall would have crippled or killed the animals instantly, leaving the hunters free to butcher them. This was no one-time event. Layers of bones stacked through the sediments proved the tactic was repeated over generations, turning the site into a prehistoric slaughterhouse. In Germany, at Schöningen, archaeologists discovered wooden spears dating back 300,000 years, among the oldest weapons ever found. These finely balanced spears were found alongside horse bones, arranged in patterns suggesting a coordinated ambush. The horses appear to have been herded into confined areas where the hunters could strike. Such evidence shows that even early humans had the knowledge and cooperation to kill multiple large animals at once, rather than relying on chance encounters. Cro-Magnons expanded these methods to a greater scale. At Pavlov and Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, massive bone beds contain the remains of more than 100 mammoths. Archaeologists believe hunters used fire, noise, and coordinated drives to funnel herds into natural traps, such as gullies or pits. Once trapped, the animals were systematically killed and butchered. The sheer volume of bones indicates organized, repeated events, hunts that required planning, communication, and division of labor among dozens of people. The ecological impact of these hunts was enormous. A single mass kill could supply a group with meat, hides, fat, and bones for months. Mammoth bones were sometimes repurposed into building materials, forming the frames of shelters. Tusks and ribs became tools and fuel. In such events, every part of the animal was used, leaving little waste. But by removing entire herds from local ecosystems, humans may have caused cascading effects that reshaped animal populations. The complexity of these hunts also makes me think of human strife. If Neanderthals were able to push mammoths off of rocks, they might have used the same strategy against rival groups, locking them in caves, valleys, or other small spaces. Archaeological clues point to this dark option. Some burned cave layers have places where human remains just vanish. This could mean that people used fire and geography to control animals and other people. Even though clear proof isn't common, the way the tactics make sense makes it hard to rule out the chance. The differences between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons are also apparent at these sites. Neanderthal mass kills, like Lecotte, typically targeted smaller numbers of animals at natural traps, repeated over time. Cro-Magnon kills, such as at Dolní Věstonice, were on a much larger scale, suggesting bigger groups and more advanced planning. This difference reflects the social structures of the two species. Neanderthal bands were small, rarely exceeding 30 individuals, while Cro-Magnon groups could form alliances that mobilized dozens, even hundreds, for coordinated hunts. The historical record keeps these events very clear. There are piles of broken bones for marrow and stacked deposits that show these deaths were not spread out but happened in one huge blow. Layers of burned dirt, nearby hearths, and tool fragments show that hunters stayed after the kill to work on the reward. Organizing the drive, arranging signs, and overseeing the butchering show levels of teamwork in prehistoric people that are often not given enough credit for. Predation traces on human fossils. When Ice Age researchers look at bones, they often look for small marks that show violence. Fractures, cuts, and punctures can show if a bone was broken by mistake, by an animal, or by another person. One unsettling trend has shown up among these finds. Some fossils of people show the same signs of being hunted as fossils of animals that were hunted. This means that people were not always hunters. Sometimes they were also being hunted. More than 800 pieces of Neanderthal fossils from about 120,000 years ago were found in Krapina, Croatia. This is one of the most well-known examples. A lot of these bones have cuts that look just like the ones made when deer or bison were killed. Long bones were purposely broken open to get to the marrow inside, heads were split open to get to the brains, and ribs were carefully cut along the lines where muscles attached. Based on how much was processed, it looks like this wasn't just one desperate act, but a series of them. Some experts think that Krapina is the first large-scale proof that Neanderthals hunted their own kind. At El Cidrón in Spain, the story grows even darker. The remains of 12 Neanderthals, men, women and children, were discovered in a single cave chamber. Analysis revealed cut marks, disarticulation and marrow extraction consistent with butchery. But in some cases, the trauma occurred before death. Sharp force injuries on skulls and ribs suggest these individuals were killed first, then processed afterward. This points not to ritual, but to organized predation. Neanderthals consuming members of their own group during a famine. The forensic detail is chilling. These were not the bones of enemies, but of kin. Projectile injuries provide another window into human-on-human predation. At sites in France and the Near East, skeletal remains of early Homo sapiens show puncture wounds consistent with stone-tipped weapons. The angles of entry and penetration depth resemble hunting strikes delivered against large animals. In several cases, the wounds are fatal. This proves that projectile technology, so effective against prey, was also turned on humans. For Neanderthals, who lacked long-range weapons, this may have been one of the most lethal disadvantages in encounters with Homo sapiens. The trauma patterns themselves are telling. Some Neanderthal remains show parry fractures on forearms, injuries caused when individuals tried to block incoming blows. Others show deep punctures in ribs and vertebrae, targeting vital organs, just as hunters would with animals. Skull fractures mirror those of prey struck at close range. Combined with butchery marks, these injuries form a picture of deliberate, repeated human predation. Why would this happen? The simplest explanation is competition. In an Ice Age world of scarce resources, eliminating rival groups secured both territory and calories. For Neanderthals and Homo sapiens alike, killing competitors not only removed threats, but also provided immediate food. In small bands, even a single defeat could mean the collapse of an entire group. Archaeological evidence suggests these confrontations were not isolated, but occurred across multiple regions. Predation may also have been opportunistic. Isolated individuals, the elderly or weakened members, could have been targeted in times of crisis. The fact that cut marks and projectile wounds appear in both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens contexts shows that neither species was immune. Both were predators, and both could become prey under the right conditions. The data also shows a worrying link between violent behavior and survival tactics. People were hunted with the same tools that were used to kill reindeer and bison: ambushes, projectiles, and close-range hits. This mixing of groups shows that early humans did not clearly separate animals they hunted from people they were competing with. In the hard environment of the Ice Age, bodies were bodies, and sometimes treating people like resources was the only way to stay alive. Bone modification into tools and ornaments. Most people think of broken flint blades or wooden swords that have been burned to a hardness. But evidence from archaeology shows that bone, from both animals and people, was also very important. The most disturbing thing for experts is that in some cases, human bones were changed on purpose to become tools, decorations, and even items with meaning. This shows that people in the past saw the body not only as food to eat, but also as something that could be used again and again. Gough's Cave in England is one of the best examples of this. Human heads that had been carefully made into bowls were found there. The edges were smoothed, cut marks show that they were prepared on purpose, and the end shapes looked like drinking cups. Along with these skull cups, long bones had been broken up and scraped, showing signs of having been used as retouchers, which are tools for making stone blades sharper and more precise. These changes show that the people who lived in Gough's Cave thought about human bones in the same practical way they thought about animal bones. In France, Moulaguersy Cave presents a similar picture. Here, Neanderthal bones were found mixed with butchered deer remains. Some human fragments were shaped into secondary tools, bearing impact scars identical to those seen on animal bones used as retouchers. This shows that Neanderthals, like Homo sapiens, occasionally turned the bodies of their own species into part of their toolkits. Such modifications were not random. They followed consistent patterns of shaping and use. Beyond tools, human remains also became ornaments. At several Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens sites, pierced human teeth and small bone fragments were discovered with holes drilled for suspension. These may have been worn as pendants or stitched into clothing. The careful preparation of these pieces, drilling, smoothing, and polishing, suggests they carried meaning, whether as trophies, tokens of remembrance, or status symbols within a group. Unlike tools, these ornaments were not about survival, but about identity and display. Microscopic analysis helps confirm intentional shaping. Under magnification, cut marks show flesh removal before modification. Polished edges indicate repeated handling, and microscopic striations prove that bones were used to strike or refine stone tools. These technical details prove that bone modification was a practiced skill, not a desperate improvisation. Human remains were deliberately incorporated into daily activities and cultural practices. The cultural meaning of this behavior is complex. On one hand, it reflects pragmatism. In a survival context, no part of a body, animal or human, was wasted. On the other hand, it reveals symbolic thinking. A scraper made from the femur of a rival, or an ornament carved from a human tooth, was more than practical. It was loaded with social and psychological meaning. These objects could serve as reminders of victories, warnings to enemies, or memorials of kin. Some archaeologists argue that bone tools made from humans were meant as intimidation. Wielding a weapon or scraper carved from the remains of an enemy could have reinforced dominance within a group or frightened outsiders. Others believe they carried spiritual weight, linking the living to the essence of the dead. In both cases, the transformation of bones into objects reveals a worldview where human remains retained power and significance long after death. The practice was not limited to a single region. Modified human bones have been documented across Europe, from Neanderthal contexts in France to Cro-Magnon sites in England and Central Europe. This continuity suggests that bone modification was part of a broader behavioral pattern, appearing independently in different groups, but following similar logic. When bodies were available, whether from famine, conflict, or ritual, bones were not discarded. They were repurposed into tools, ornaments, or symbols. Fire as a weapon of extermination. Making fire was one of the most important things people ever did. During the harsh Ice Age, it kept people warm, gave them light at night, kept them safe from animals, and let them cook raw meat. But what we know from archaeology is that fire also had a darker side. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens didn't just use fire to stay alive. They also made weapons out of it. Fire was used on purpose to destroy and take over, as shown by evidence found in caves and open-air places across Europe and beyond. Caves hold some of the clearest evidence. At Les Feux in France, thick layers of ash and charcoal cover earlier layers of human occupation. These aren't ordinary cooking hearths. They are too large, too widespread, and in some cases, accompanied by burned human bones. The placement suggests that the fires were set deliberately to suffocate or flush out occupants. Smoke inside an enclosed cave would have been devastating. Within minutes, oxygen would drop, breathing would become unbearable, and anyone inside would either flee or collapse. Archaeologists studying such layers believe they mark deliberate attempts to drive rivals from their shelters or kill them outright. Burn patterns in Central Europe tell a similar story. Sites once occupied by Neanderthals sometimes show alternating sequences. A layer of habitation, then ash and charred debris, followed by signs of occupation by Homo sapiens. The sudden switch, with fire damage in between, suggests fire was used to seize territory without direct combat. For groups living in small numbers, smoke and flame could be far deadlier than spears. Unlike face-to-face battles, fire required little risk for the attackers. A torch at the entrance of a cave, a blaze in dry brush near a valley, and an entire rival group could be neutralized. In parts of Eastern Africa and Central Europe, archaeologists have found large burned patches in settlement layers, far too organized to be wildfires. The shape and distribution suggest fires were deliberately placed around encampments, forming rings of destruction. Such tactics could destroy food stores, contaminate water sources with ash, and leave shelters uninhabitable. Even if people escaped, they had nothing to return to. Fire was both a weapon and warning, a way to erase a group's claim on land. The effect on the mind was just as strong. Fear was carried by fire more than any other force. It was hard to avoid the roar of the flames, the thick smoke, and the orange glow that lit up the night. Rats and people both ran away from it. Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens lived in caves and other simple dwellings, so they had to use fire as a defense. Archaeological evidence of sites being suddenly abandoned, layers of burned waste and no one coming back to live there for hundreds of years, suggests that fire not only killed, but also turned once safe places into places where people were not allowed to go. Control of fire was uneven between groups. Neanderthals are known to have mastered fire for warmth and cooking, but evidence suggests Homo sapiens were more skilled at carrying and starting fires quickly. Portable fire kits, such as flint and pyrite struck together to produce sparks, are associated more often with Homo sapiens sites. This ability to transport flame meant they could weaponize it at will, invading Neanderthal territories with torches ready. If Neanderthals relied on maintaining natural fires, they were at a disadvantage in conflicts where sudden ignition was a tactical edge. The most chilling proof is the burned remains of human skulls found in caves. At some places, bones that are still intact show signs of having been exposed to heat. This means that the people died in the fires instead of being burned afterward. The fact that these bodies were found deep inside shelters and not near openings suggests that the victims were stuck. Since this happened over and over in different areas, it's not likely that these were mistakes. It instead points to the planned use of fire as a way to kill. This strategy also aligned with broader patterns of Neanderthal decline. Fire enabled small bands of Homo sapiens to defeat or displace larger Neanderthal groups with minimal risk. Unlike direct combat, which favored Neanderthal strength, fire exploited their reliance on caves and limited mobility. A single attack could wipe out an entire group or force survivors to abandon critical territory. The efficiency of fire as a weapon may help explain why Neanderthal strongholds collapsed so quickly after contact with Cro-Magnons. Sudden Neanderthal population decline. One of the biggest problems in the history of people is where the Neanderthals went. They lived in Europe and Western Asia for more than 300,000 years, making it through harsh ice ages, killing huge animals, and making homes in caves and valleys. However, they were gone in just a few thousand years after Homo sapiens came to Europe. Genetic and archaeological data shows that they went extinct quickly, across a large area, and for good. But what caused it to fall apart so quickly? Radiocarbon dating provides the first clues. At sites in France, Spain, and Croatia, Neanderthal fossils consistently date to before 40,000 years ago, while Homo sapiens remains, and tools appear immediately afterward. There is little overlap in the record. In regions such as southern France and the Iberian Peninsula, Neanderthals vanish within only a few generations of sapiens' arrival. This abrupt succession suggests more than coincidence. It looks like a replacement. Settlement patterns reinforce the point. Caves long inhabited by Neanderthals, such as those in Dordogne, France, show signs of burning, abandonment, or sudden cultural shifts. The distinctive stone tools of Neanderthals disappear and are replaced by blade-based technology and ornaments associated with Cro-Magnons. Even in regions once considered Neanderthal strongholds, like Gibraltar, their presence faded rapidly after sapiens arrived. By 37,000 years ago, their populations had collapsed across most of Europe. Climate instability added pressure. During this period, known as marine isotope stage 3, temperatures swung dramatically in just a few decades. Ice sheets expanded and retreated, altering landscapes and disrupting ecosystems. Stable hunting grounds vanished. Neanderthals, who were adapted to particular prey and habitats, faced increasing challenges. By contrast, Homo sapiens were more flexible. They developed long-range hunting strategies, used a wider variety of tools, and exploited diverse resources. In times of rapid climate change, adaptability often spelled survival. Genetic evidence provides another critical piece. DNA extracted from Neanderthal remains shows signs of population bottlenecks, periods when their numbers shrank drastically. Inbreeding became more common, reducing genetic diversity and resilience to disease. Meanwhile, sapiens' genetic record shows much larger, healthier breeding populations. This disparity meant that when contact occurred, sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals both in numbers and reproductive success. Interbreeding happened, but it was limited. Today, most humans outside Africa carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, proof of encounters, but not enough to have saved Neanderthals as a species. Conflict likely sealed their fate. Archaeological signs of trauma, cut marks, and burn layers suggest Neanderthals didn't simply fade away, they were pushed out. Homo sapiens had superior projectile weapons, more complex social networks, and greater population density. Small, isolated Neanderthal groups were vulnerable to ambush, starvation, and displacement. Even if they fought bravely, they lacked the numbers and long-range firepower to withstand repeated attacks. The speed with which they are going away is amazing. Some parts of Western Europe lose Neanderthal sites almost overnight and are replaced by sapiens camps and cave sites with lots of art. Neanderthals left behind simple tools and little meaningful behavior. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, left behind painted walls, carved trinkets, and huge hunting camps. The historical record changes from being useful to being full of culture, showing that one bloodline has won over another. Some researchers suggest that disease may have played a role. Contact between sapiens and Neanderthals could have introduced pathogens for which Neanderthals had no immunity. In small populations already weakened by scarcity and inbreeding, such outbreaks could have been devastating. Combined with climate stress and conflict, disease may have accelerated their collapse. It is clear that Neanderthals went from being powerful hunters to living alone for a short time in prehistory, and then disappeared totally. Instead of dying out over hundreds of thousands of years, they died out in just a few thousand years, which in evolutionary terms is like blink of an eye. For sapiens, this meant they could spread around the world. It was the end of a long and strong story for the Neanderthals. The story of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is written not just in fossils, but in fire, bone and blood. A tale of survival, conflict, and unexpected connection that still shapes us today. If you found these discoveries as fascinating and unsettling as we did, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more deep dives into prehistory, and check out our next video, where we uncover even more hidden truths buried in the shadows of our past.